Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoon, and on this one show of dollars and cents, I'm going to return to the economic collapse, but in a very different way. And for those of you who have just discovered me on this YouTube channel of Schoonworks, I suggest you might want to go back and look at my website, www.drschoon.com. And because some of you have actually gone through all my videos on dollars and cents and sort of exhausted them and wonder when I've got more coming or whatever. And it is true that I've got some from last year that we haven't posted yet for one reason or another. And that we release these in sort of an inconstant manner over time. But what I suggest is that you might want to take a look at my website and go to my articles. Because after I put my book up, Time of the Vulture, How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process, I began writing articles that were posted by top gold and silver sites across the world. And that's how I made my reputation. And under my archived articles, you will find a lot of writings that I have that may catch your attention. And on that same vein, I'm going to talk today about the economic collapse. Is my old stomping grounds. I seem to have a different point of view about it that keeps my attention even to this day, because for one thing, the collapse isn't over. But I want to talk about what happens during a deflationary collapse such as we're going through today. This is exactly what happened during the Great Depression, and this is why I believe that we are on the verge of another Great Depression with an added twist, a monetary collapse at the concurrently, which is going to make what we went through in the 1930s, as terrible as it is, even much worse. But my story is that there's a purpose to this, that history is moving. And that history is going to move us past the collapse into another era, far different than the one that we're in. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and that's not the topic that I want to talk about today. I used to wonder, far before I started thinking about these matters, the money, the depression, etc., and I started studying them in the 1990s, I used to wonder about the Great Depression, and one of the questions I had was, where did the money go? Now, most people knew that the money disappeared. I knew the money disappeared. I knew nobody had it. Even the rich people had far less than they had before, and the poor people had none at all. But the question that arose in my mind was, what happened to the money? The answer to this came to me after I began discovering what money was after all. Money, after the Bank of England got a hold of it and the Federal Reserve, was not what it had been for millennia. A device of savings, a store of value. Under the British banking system, under the central banking system, money was a coupon basically representing credit and debt in motion. All right? And the longer that credit and debt stayed in motion, the more the bankers benefited, because they benefited from the charging of interest on those coupons, which they called money. I mean, after all, if the bankers introduced their paper money and called them coupons, it was already suspect enough that people wouldn't use it. All right? They would much prefer the gold and silver coins that they had known to be money for millennia. But this new type of money that was backed by the state, that you could trade for gold and silver and turn it in at a prearranged price, the British bankers called money. But in fact, they were truly coupons representing credit and debt in motion. And as long as the motion kept continuing, as long as the capital markets kept expanding, no one was the wiser. Because you could easily turn in these coupons for gold and silver as required. Now, the longer the scheme kept going, the less and less requirement people had. They began getting used to these pieces of paper, these coupons called money, and began calling it money and believed they were money themselves. But let me assure you, they are not money in the traditional sense that money was for millennium. They were essentially coupons representing credit and debt in motion. Now, what had happened during the Great Depression of the 1930s was that the amount of credit had created so much debt that the collapse of the debt, starting in 1929, which brought down the banking system in the United States, sat and destroyed the velocity of money moving through the system. All right? Then that's why, quote, money disappeared during the Great Depression. Because credit and debt was no longer in motion as it had been. In the frenzied run-up, which they called the Roaring Twenties, there was so much credit and debt flying around that everybody thought they were rich. Well, when the bubble collapsed in 1929 and bringing down the banks with it in 1930 and 31, the amount of money, quote, money, which really means coupons representing credit and debt, disappeared. All right? Money, as we knew it, disappeared. This is the same thing that's happening today. The collapse of the sequential bubbles, of the dot-com bubble, followed up by 7 years later by the collapse of the U.S. real estate bubble, absolutely brought the velocity of money to a screeching halt in the global economy. So what happened? Well, central bankers aren't dumb. And they're not necessarily smart, but they do have the money to hire the best and the brightest. All right? They're not dumb. What they are is greedy. And who can blame them? For 300 years, they introduced a system to the world where they were able to live off the productivity of entrepreneurs, the hard work of labor, and the insatiable need of governments to spend what is not theirs and skim off the top of that in the form of interest their way of living. It's a great way to make a living if you have the access to this system. But let me tell you, for those of you who are sitting here thinking that perhaps a lottery shot, a winning lottery ticket may pay off what you already owe, the tickets to the game are already given out, and this game is in trouble itself. But be that as it may, the question, where is the money, is a real good question. Because I'm not just talking about the money circulating as coupons, as credit and debt in motion. I'm talking to the vast wealth that the bankers and those closest to them have skimmed off the system for 300 years. Where is the money? Well, recently, an article appeared. I love the Brits. I really do. They even learned how to cook. And they were able to get away without cooking for 250 years. But they now know how to cook. When Martha and I go to England, we eat well. All right? And we love London. I mean, we really do. I mean, one of the most cherished memories is staying at Draycott Hotel with their British way of things. It's an expensive hotel, but it was quite wonderful to stay in, as the British Empire had many, many gifts. But that's not the subject of this. The subject is, what happened to the money? Well, there's an area of London known as the City, known in other vernacular as the Square Mile. And what you probably don't know about the Square Mile or the City, otherwise known as CLC, the Corporation of London, is that it exists as a separate legal entity in London itself. An entity so powerful that the Parliament, a representative of the city, sits behind the Prime Minister. Close enough to reach him, if need be. But let me assure you, they have made sure that whoever sits as Prime Minister of the British Parliament is already in their employ. Let me read you something said about this, the City of London Corporation, the Square Mile. This was written as recently as 2011. It's the dark heart of Britain, the place where democracy goes to die. Immensely powerful, equally unaccountable, its power also helps to explain why regulation of the banks is scarcely better than it was before the crash. Why there are no effective curbs on executive pay and bonuses, and why successive governments failed to act against the UK's independent tax havens. In a recent article in 2013 in Vanity Fair, they talked about this, the place they call the Square Mile, the city, and said this: over the centuries, the city has thrived thanks to a simple advantage. It has had the money to lend when governments or monarchs needed it. So the city has been granted special privileges, allowing it to remain a political fortress, withstanding the tides of history that have transformed the rest of the British city-state. It has nurtured a British tradition of welcoming foreign money with few questions asked, and so has for centuries attracted the world's wealthiest citizens. There, the Jew, the Mohammedan, the Christian transact together, Voltaire wrote in 1733, as though they all professed the same religion, and give the name of infidel to none but to the bankrupt. This is the city, the cover of England's vast network of tax havens. All right? Recently, a study was done on the money secreted away in these tax havens, mainly in the British Virgin Islands, perhaps some in the Channel Islands off the Guernsey coast. But Britain has existed for the last 300 years, the empire on the back of its British banking system that has taken advantage of the entrepreneur, the businessman, and the state by lending it money as if it really were money, but in truth but credit and debt in motion, and skimming off the vast sums that pass through its hands called interest and secreting these away. Now, not only have the bankers made bank with this money, but those in the other nations that have been their minions and worked closely as government and businesses at the seat of power have also secreted their money away in these tax havens, looked lovingly over by those who rule the city, the Square Mile, in what we call the City of London Corporation, CLC. In an article that I may write in the future, I was going to write CLC, more dangerous than HIV, and far less known, and just as dangerous for those who come into contact with it. But just like HIV was not known as being dangerous before its circumstances was discovered by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and was found to be an actual virus, there are those who still deny the power of the CLC, just as there are those who still deny that it's in fact HIV that's responsible for the AIDS virus. But let me assure you, both are true. And whereas today the HIV virus, the AIDS virus, is well known as a danger to society, as a health danger, the CLC is not. But recently something happened to pull back the cover. Recently a study was done on the amount of money secreted away through the British banking system. A little area off to the side where the Brits have established for themselves, for the very wealthy alone. The rest of us get to bank at the Royal Bank of Scotland, Deutsche Bank, Citigroup in the United States, all right? Maybe JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. That's where the commercial banking is done. But the real money, the money that doesn't disappear during deflationary contractions such as the 1930s and the collapse after 2008, are secreted away in these little tax havens, and they're not so little. In this report done by James Henry, former chief economist and director of research at McKinsey. Now, let me tell you about James Henry. You got to love this guy. Summa cum laude, Harvard. Brilliant, impeccable references. As it noted, as I just said, he was the former chief economist and director of research at McKinsey & Company. Now, a lot of you have no idea who McKinsey is. Just a sheer even less of you know about the city or the square mile. Though I am astounded by the amount of knowledge that my viewership seems to have. I made some tapes of video shows about Iran, and a lot of you seem to know about it. And I assume there's those of you about there who do know a few things about the city, but the vast majority of you I know nothing, because this knowledge is kept away from you for a reason. The powerful and the wealthy don't want the rest of us to know what they're up to. Well, James Henry was former chief economist and director of research at McKinsey. Well, let me tell you how McKinsey describes himself on their website. Quote unquote. I should use a deeper tone of voice here, as befits who these people are. McKinsey, the trusted advisor and counselor to many of the world's most influential businesses and institutions. That's who James Henry worked for before he went off on his own and went into work with, I think, the Tax Fairness Justice Group. And after a detailed study of tax havens, James Henry came to the conclusion that these tax havens are hiding $21 to $32 trillion in assets. 21 to $32 trillion has been taken and skimmed off this revolving carnival of credit and debt set in motion by the bankers, taken aside and sit parked away from the world's eyes, right under where you would think they would be, under the eyes of England, the center of finance, overseen by the CLC. Now it's there, but you can't get to it. It's there, but you can't see it. It's sort of there, but not there. The money exists, but no one knows it. All right? Now, whose money is this? It's sort of like the Vatican. The Vatican's bank is in such disrepute that if you go and visit the Holy See today, you can't use your credit card at the Vatican, because they will not come clean about the money that's in the Vatican bank. Just like these offshore trusts don't want you to know who's there, whose money has been skimmed off the top. Well, there's information coming about it right now, and it seems to be an unholy group of businessmen and politicians from around the world. And in a recent study done by James Henry, who was formerly the chief economist at McKinsey and Company, which was they bill themselves as the advisors to the world's wealthy, powerful corporations. He came up with a working estimate of how much he believed was hidden away in these secret bank accounts. The sum is anywhere between 21 and 32 trillion dollars. Now, this amount of money is enormous. And what has just happened is, because of a concerted effort with a number of journalists around the world, they went to work on finding out who had their money in these bank accounts. And it's truly astounding. It's a combination of government politicians and shady characters and very, very wealthy individuals. One of the people whose name is on these British Virgin Island accounts is the granddaughter of Ferdinand Marcos. All right? Now, in her accounts is estimated to be $5 billion. Now, that's a lot of money. And she may be a hard-working individual, whoever she is. She may be a kind soul, a nice and kind person. But it's my belief that her money came from Ferdinand Marcos, who was the dictator of the Philippines for years. And his money that basically came down to her came from his discovery of what is called Yamashita's gold. Yamashita's gold is the term that the media has given to the gold that the Japanese stole from China during its 25-year occupation after the Japanese invaded China and looted it. And then were trying to get the loot back to Japan before the war ended. And because the American military presence, the Navy and the submarines, had basically cut off their ability to take this gold bullion back to China, the Japanese decided instead to transfer it to the Philippines, far closer, where they would hide it. And as a part of their theory that they would arrange a negotiated surrender with the Americans, and as part of that negotiated surrender would keep control of the Philippines. Now, the atomic bomb blew a hole in that theory real quick. And so that all that gold was trapped in the Philippines and was discovered by the Americans and Marcos after World War II ended. The question is, what happened to that gold? What happened to that gold? Well, the question of what happened to China's stolen gold, I like to use that term rather than Yamashita's gold because it's really China's stolen gold, was that the Americans and Marcos discovered that the Japanese had hidden vast sums of gold bullion in the Philippines. All right? When this was discovered, it was a choice made at the very highest levels, one, not to tell the Chinese about it. Now, I'm not going to spend any time wondering about why the Chinese weren't told that all of a sudden the loot stolen from the Japanese had been discovered, secreted away in the Philippines by Marcos. But the decision was made not to tell the Chinese. And so what happened is the CIA was basically the recipient of that gold. Now, how do you get gold from the form of bullion back into the monetary system in the form of dollars or wherever, where it can be used by whatever agency wants to use it? And in this case, by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States to pursue whatever they wanted to pursue off the record, far away from the prying eyes of the United States government and the United States Congress. This process is called laundering, money laundering. All right? Now, how did the United States manage to launder billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, probably, of China's stolen gold back into the system? Now, it's curious how these things have come to me. One of my truly good friends, Professor Antal Fekete, is the person who even raised this, and he knew nothing about Yamashita's gold. Or if he did, it didn't come into why he made the following statement. But in a statement made by Professor Antal Fekete about Barrick Gold Corporation, the world's largest gold mining company at the time, in 1992, he said the only reason he could see for what Barrick was doing was forward selling their gold at prices so cheap, which was a self-defeating mechanism for any corporation to do, was gold laundering. And I want to say this is what, in fact, Barrick may in fact have been doing during that time. I want to read from my book, Light in a Dark Place. But what this came from, this information came from, was from an article posted on the internet called Collateral Damage. And for anybody who's really serious about what those of the Black Hand have been doing and why the world is the way it is, would do well to download this document from the internet. It's called Collateral Damage. And I want to read what it said about Barrick Corporation, the world's largest gold mining company. And this because it talks about that stolen gold and the CIA. U.S. intelligence operations have been siphoning off the gold, China's stolen gold, for 30 years. However, in 1986, because they discovered that gold in the late 1940s, all right? However, in 1986, Vice President of the United States, George Bush, took over the gold from Marcos, and the gold was removed to a series of banks, notably Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, UBS, United Bank of Switzerland, and Bankers Trust, and held in a gold depository in Clawton, Switzerland. In 1992, George Bush Sr. served on the advisory board of Barrick Gold. The Barrick Gold operation would create billions of dollars of paper gold by creating quote-unquote gold derivatives, and would become an investment for nearly every gold bullion bank associated with the Marcos gold recovery of China's stolen gold. These banks would loan gold to Barrick, which would then sell the borrowed gold as derivatives with the promise of replacing the borrowed gold with their gold mining operation. Barrick, which has no mining operations in Europe, used two refineries in Switzerland, MKS Finance and Argor Heraeus SA, both on the Italian border near Milan, a few hours away from the gold depository in Clawton in Zurich. The question that Barrick and other banks need to avoid answering: what gold was Barrick refining in Switzerland, as they have no mines in that region? Barrick would become a quiet gold-producing partner for a number of major banks, and in its activities would become subject to an FBI investigation into gold price fixing. The records of this investigation were kept in the FBI office on the 23rd floor of the North Tower, which was destroyed by bomb blast shortly before the tower collapsed on 9/11. So what we have here is gold laundering, which is the flip side of money laundering. My friend, Professor Antal Fekete, had looked at Barrick from the standpoint of a shareholder. The good professor had been a mathematics professor and had entrusted all his retirement funds to shares in Barrick, which, because of his belief in gold, that he felt that they were protected and would serve him well when he retired. But much to his amazement, he watched what Barrick was doing with their investments, selling gold below market into the market for 25 years. And Professor Fekete was astounded at what they did. He wrote Barrick letters asking him, what were they doing? How could they believe, how could they act in such a manner that was detrimental to the shareholders of Barrick by selling gold forward cheaply at these prices? And the good professor could only say, as an aside, unless it was a gold laundering operation that made no sense to him why they were doing it. Well, in 1992, Professor Antal Fekete had no idea what Barrick was up to. No one had any idea what Barrick was up to until this paper was put out on the internet by an E.P. Heidner, which may or may not be his real name, about 9/11 and what happened. That in fact Barrick was involved not in money laundering but in gold laundering. And this is how the granddaughter of Ferdinand Marcos ended up with $5 billion in untraceable money in her account very recently in the British Virgin Islands. This is the flip side of money laundering, which was gold laundering. Now, you hear a lot about the United States government cracking down on Iranian money laundering, on terrorist money laundering. And the truth of the matter is, that's because they've been in that business for years. The United States used BCCI, one of the most corrupt banks in the world, to launder their funds. When the British finally shut down BCCI, it was over the objections of the United States government. The CIA knows about money laundering because they've been doing it for an awfully long time. Now, another large money laundering operation happened during 9/11. And it's also, I want to read to you from my book, Light in a Dark Place, about why they used 9/11 as a cover. The sums involved in that laundering operation were in excess of $400 billion. 10 years before 9/11, the United States government had set in motion, covertly of course, a scheme to buy up the assets of the then imploding Soviet Empire, the USSR. And so they floated 10-year notes backed by these gold deposits on world markets and used this money to buy up the assets of the Soviet Union, which was then in disarray. Well, the bonds were due in 10 years, in September of 9/11. They had been issued 10 years before with a purpose of buying up the assets of the Soviet Union, and now they had to make good on them. Now they had to make good on billions of dollars worth of securities they had issued 10 years before. What happened was an amazing series of coincidences, and they weren't coincidences at all. How I became cognizant of these things, I was running down, when I read Heidner's document about 9/11, I became curious because I only knew one person I didn't know him personally, but I had a little insight into one of the main players of this game that is played by those who play in the dark arts, all right? Money laundering, gold, the hidden world, the CIA. And the name I had was Bruce Rappaport. The only reference I had ever had to Bruce Rappaport was when I had met Howard Hughes's banker in prison in 1986. His name was Norman Therian, all right? And he told me a story in prison about how he had been approached by members of the Reagan White House in 1983 to approach the Saudis to raise money for a fund to help the Muslims in Afghanistan. Norman had done so, raised the money, which was $500 million, all right? But because of an argument he had with one of the principals behind this, he had been approached, not by the CIA, of course. He had been approached by a company called Transglobal Movie Productions, which had a New York address. The curious thing about this movie production company was the head of Transglobal Movie Productions was General Robert E. Cushman, former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. All right? Former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. It's in this book, in my book, Light in a Dark Place, because Norman gave me papers that he'd been asked to destroy after this thing was over. And he didn't. He kept it. And that's how it came into my hands in 1986, 87, because Norman gave me copies of these papers. Well, General Robert E. Cushman was not only former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, he was a former Deputy Director of the CIA. And he happened also to be the Chairman of the Board of Transglobal Movie Productions Company. Well, ain't that interesting? What the heck is the former Commandant of the United States Marine Corps doing as the Chairman of the Board of a movie production company that never made one movie? Well, that same question could be asked of George Bush Sr. What was the former head of the CIA, past President of the United States, doing on the advisory board of Barrick Gold Corporation? Well, it seems to me he had a lot of reasons to be there, because he was instrumental in getting, evidently, in getting the gold laundering operations of China's stolen gold, called by the media Yamashita's gold, to be cleaned up by Barrick during the 1990s, whereupon my good friend Antal E. Fekete went in a rage to the management of Barrick and said, "What are you doing? You're ruining this company by forward selling this gold into the market at below market prices." He said the only justification for doing something like this is gold laundering. Well, it happens to be my good friend Professor Antal Fekete had inadvertently hit the nail on the head. Massive laundering operations go on all the time in the world of covert securities, because money and power are merely the different sides of the same coin. What happened when I found out, and this is how I found out about Bruce Rappaport's name, is that Norman told me what had happened. He showed me these papers about what Transglobal had done, and how, because he helped these people take down $500 million, get $500 million from the Saudis, he had an argument with the good general, with Robert E. Cushman, over what he had just been told. Cushman told him that what they had done with part of the money that they had gotten from the Saudis, they were going to buy the captured arms that the Syrian army had abandoned during the Six-Day War, and the Israelis had kept them in a warehouse in Israel. And now, through one of the other members on Transglobal Movie Productions board, the movie production company, was a man named Rabbi Morton Rosenthal. Now, for those of you who have a computer, you might want to Google the name of Rabbi Morton Rosenthal, who also sat on the board of directors of Transglobal Movie Productions, the movie production company that came into existence only not to make movies, but to shake down the Saudis for $500 million to help their brethren, Muslim brethren in Afghanistan in the war of liberation against Soviet oppression. Or so they said. Well, what happened is, when Norman found out that Transglobal would really, Rosenthal and Cushman were going to do this with the Saudi money, Norman had a fit. Why did Norman object? Because Norman's friends were the Saudis. That's why he was approached by the CIA front organization to ask the Saudis for money, because they knew Norman knew the Saudis tightly because of his relationships with Adnan Khashoggi and his ties in the oil business. So Norman had approached the Saudis. The Saudis had given him $500 million to help fund this Afghan resistance, and the money disappeared. Totally disappeared. Norman was cut out of the deal, and a year later was charged with crimes in the federal court, illegally extradited from the state of Monaco to face these charges in New York, in the United States, where he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, whereupon I meet him in prison. Now, where was I ever going to meet Howard Hughes' private banker, except as a former hippie in prison? And that's where I met Norman, and that's when he told me his extraordinary story. Now, how did I find out the name of Bruce Rappaport? Well, because as a result, into the Senate investigation into the Iran-Contra affair, another illegal operation run out of the Reagan White House, the money from the Iran-Contra affair of the sales of arms to Iran illegally was found to be deposited in the bank account of an Israeli-Swiss banker named Bruce Rappaport in his secret CIA Swiss bank account. along with $500 million of a U.S. Saudi fund intended to help the Afghan resistance. Now, Norman had told me this story in 1987, 86 in prison. A story he told no one. A story so covert only because he had operated at those levels. This is the world of money laundering, my friends. This is the world they don't want you to know about. This is how they do it.